Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alison Van Dyk. I'm the Executive Director of the Temple of Understanding, and I want to welcome you to our series, Eco-Justice for All, what the world religious leaders are doing about the climate crisis. This is an ongoing program of the Temple of Understandings, and it incorporates our outreach into the area of environmental awareness and advocacy. As an interfaith organization, we present diverse perspectives from scientific to spiritual viewpoints on the climate emergency, and we offer various solutions to those problems. We want this to be an interactive session, so we're going to be leaving some time for questions. You can either press the hand signal, or you can put something in the chat, and Susie Mazzoli, our program director, will be working with you in terms of your questions. And we are also going to have a response by our UN representative, Grove Harris, after the discussion. So I want to welcome our guest speakers, the Reverend Fletcher Harper and the Reverend Brian McGurk, who are going to address today the Faith and Science Towards COP26, the meeting convened by Pope Francis. Reverend Fletcher Harper is an Episcopal priest and Executive Director of Green Faith, a global multi-faith climate and environmental justice network. He's an internationally recognized author, speaker, and pioneer of the worldwide religious environmental movement. Reverend Brian McGurk has served as rector of St. Christopher's Church, Chatham, Massachusetts, here on the Cape, since 2003, and as Dean of the Cape and Islands Deanery from 2004 to 2014. He also chairs with Susan Starkey the Interfaith Consortium Faith Communities Ecumenical Network, FCEN, here on the Cape and Islands. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
First, I'd like to thank you all for having me here today and to say what an honor it is to share this webinar, this Zoom, with Fletcher. I'm a big admirer of his work. And I thought if I could take a minute or two just to explain who I am. I do not have the stature of Fletcher, but I think my context on Cape Cod says a lot about why I'm here. And very well, hopefully briefly, I would say that I'm an Episcopal priest. I've been so for 25 years. I'm the rector of St. Christopher's Church here in Chatham. And as Alison said, I'm the co-chair of the Faith Communities Environmental Network. And I'll say a little bit more on that in a second. But in terms of my personal story, I was born in Connecticut and raised in the Caribbean on Barbados. So I spent my childhood immersed in the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea. And I had a definite experience of beauty, wonder, awe, reverence, relationship, et cetera. And I think it set the tone for the rest of my life. Later in my career as a priest, I was able to go to South Africa representing the Diocese of Virginia. And as I toured the township churches during a couple of my visits there, I remember being in Orange Farm outside of Johannesburg and looking around and seeing crushing poverty, wonderful people, and looking back, the Pope's phrase, cry of the earth, cry of the poor, was really readily apparent to me because as those people were suffering from crushing poverty, the land was suffering. The townships had open sewers, et cetera. So every time I hear the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, I think of the people in the townships of South Africa. I just wanted to give a little context of my work here. And that is, I am on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And as far as the geography, we're a spit of sand that extends out into the Atlantic Ocean. We're the sacred land of the Wampanoags. And the Cape has been described as the epicenter of the global climate change because we're a fragile ecosystem. We're surrounded by water on all sides, a lot of coastline, and the Atlantic, as we all know, is rapidly warming, more so than any other body of water. So we're seeing profound environmental changes right now. And I think in some ways we are the face of climate change. the Boston Globe did a multimedia piece about the Cape, and it was entitled Climate Change on Cape Cod on the Edge of a Warming World. And basically, they said that the Cape we love is at risk. Cape Cod is perched on a stretch of ocean warming faster than nearly any in the world. And as much as we might wish it away, as hard as it is to try to ignore it, the effects of climate change here are already visible, tangible, measurable, disturbing. So that's some of the context here. Where I am in Chatham, Massachusetts, we have a sizable fishing fleet. Fishing is a historic industry, and it's alive and well here, although it's challenged in many ways by the climate. Cape Cod is also blessed with world-renowned scientific organizations, Woods Hole Oceanographic, the Woodwell Research Center, and the Center for Coastal Studies. And as many of you probably know, the first major offshore wind farm, Vineyard Wind, is set to go, and we have another in the queue, Mayflower Wind. So we also have we have active chapters of Sierra 350, Audubon, Cape Light Compact, and we also have a very active series of town-wide climate action groups that have been lobbying their select boards to declare climate emergencies, et cetera, et cetera. We're also the home of something called the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. It was established after Paris by Rich Delaney, the CEO, and it's an intersectional. It brings the different Cape and islands-based sectors together in the areas of energy, transportation, education, faith, science, finance, et cetera, et cetera. And tomorrow, as a matter of fact, we'll have a day-long net zero conference entitled Powering Change at the Grassroots Level. And Senator Markey will kick off the day's events. 600 people are signed up for it. So that is going on. As mentioned, I, along with Susan Stark here, the co-chair of the Faith Communities Environmental Network, it's 32 churches, faith communities really, on the Cape, working for eco-justice through education, advocacy, and best practice. What we try to do is function in all three of those areas. 2 years ago, we led a faith science forum, and Mary Evelyn Tucker represented the faith side of the panel, and Philip Duffy, the director of Woods Hole Research, the science, and there were politicians and youth reps, et cetera, who joined that. So we try to connect people across Cape-wide sectors. Basically, I think what I can represent here is the fact that I'm a parish priest. So I confront these issues on a local level as well as a regional level, connecting with other faith communities. And, you know, in my own philosophy theory, any kinds of transformational change begins with spirituality and contemplation. And I do that daily as a parish priest and work it out into our social justice work. So I found personally that the meeting on faith and science towards COP26, the address of Pope Francis and the joint appeal, highly important because I have to face pushback, the pushback of you're too political, Brian, from people I see each and every day, and having the sanction, the authority, the weight, the hierarchy of the Pope, the ecumenical patriarch, the Archbishop of Canterbury, as something to back up some of what I'm saying and some of what I'm trying to do, is really, really important. So when Fletcher's article, when I read Fletcher's article, Stop Preaching About Being Good Stewards of the Earth, when he talked about naming names and really pointing out what was critical, it spoke directly to me. Because in an era after 4 years of the last administration, getting a climate emergency message out to people in the midst of such polarization and politics was very difficult week to week. But I was really encouraged and empowered by the call that I think Fletcher extended to all parish, local, regional people of faith. So I really appreciate that, and we'll try to live up to that. So I will try to, in the words of Fletcher, be a prophet with some thunder. But thank you, and I hope I didn't go on too long about me.
That's really great, Brian, and it's so good to connect up. And this must be the Episcopal priest hour here, because I'm an Episcopal priest too, and it's good to be together. And really good, I think, to have this dialogue to address these tensions that you referred to in terms of, how do we bring these issues into local communities and into people's lives. This is not an abstract issue, and you can't just deal with it abstractly. Like you, and like I think just about every person, I've had throughout my life experiences of the presence of God outdoors. And honestly, those are the experiences that have helped me feel most alive, most deeply rooted in myself. And there's an undeniable sacredness to that kind of experience wherever it happens. I've also, as an activist, had those kinds of experiences when I've seen people of different backgrounds, different religions, different races working together to try to build public moral influence to create change. And to me, that's an equally sacred kind of thing. And I think the confluence of those two types of experiences are what have brought me to the work that I do with Green Faith, which is an interfaith climate and environmental justice organization, and have sustained me in doing that work. And to pick up on something that Brian alluded to, whether you live on Cape Cod or northern New Jersey, where I live, or just about anywhere on the planet, you'd have to be either willfully ignoring the climate and the weather, or just ideologically unwilling to accept the reality that things are changing. And I think that's something that's new over the past 5 years or so on a widespread level. It's been clearer for longer for many people in the global South and for many farmers and workers whose day-to-day work exposes them to the natural world very directly. But the signs of change are here. Just a couple of weeks ago, when Hurricane Ida swept through northern New Jersey, the apartment that I live in came literally about a half an inch of water away from being badly flooded. And there were cars that had been lifted up from the street and moved 15 feet onto lawns and sidewalks and that sort of thing because of the force and the power of the flooding. And I have colleagues in Latin America and Asia and Africa who've suffered devastating impacts because of climate change and its manifestation. So I think we're in a time now where we're seeing that this stuff is for real, and it's hitting home intellectually and experientially like never before. In the midst of this, one of the things that I wanted to reflect on in relationship to the religious leaders statement and to the faith plans, and the architects of both of those efforts are wonderful folks whose work I've known and admired for many, many years. From my perspective, what's really important at this point in time is to remind ourselves regularly that the causes of climate change on many levels are not a mystery. We know and have known for decades, going on 40 years now, that the two biggest causes of a changing climate are burning fossil fuels and cutting down forests. And ironically, it was fossil fuel companies who knew that best and first, because as we've seen, thanks to really incredible reporting by Inside Climate News and others, that their own scientists were telling them this back in the 1970s. Just last week, there was a big revelation in the French media. Researchers in France had uncovered evidence that Total, now called Total Energies, the big French energy multinational, had known back in the 70s about the impact of burning fossil fuels on the climate. So there's this long-standing awareness. And when one looks at the severity of the problem in relationship to that, it really brings me up short to recognize how much influence those extractive industries exercise over our governments and over society as a whole, in the way that they shape people's sense of reality, in the way in which they shape political realities. We've seen even just since COVID-19 hit that fossil fuel companies have gotten far more COVID relief and recovery funding from governments around the world than renewable energies at exactly the same time that we need to be making a transition. So when Green Faith looks at this issue, what we say is, as difficult as it is, and I was a parish priest for 10 years and fully understand what Brian was talking about, when you're a parish priest or a rabbi in a congregation or an imam in a mosque or whatever, you say something on the holy day and you got to deal with it on the next day. So, and at the same time, with this emergency present and getting worse, I don't know any way around this except to say that we have to speak about the fact that we've got an industry that is holding the world's future captive, when we've got technologies that can help us ensure that absolutely everybody on the planet has access to electricity. We've got banks and financial institutions, which, and this is hard to believe, but since the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, in the 6 years since that's happened, banks have actually put more money into new fossil fuel projects. Now, I think that on one level, it's really important to depersonalize this and to recognize what the Christian theologians for a long time have talked about as systemic sin, that there are very powerful systems at play. And we also know that the way that those systems get changed is when social movements, moral social movements, build power, change the culture, change a sense of what's right and what's not okay. And that's, what this movement that Brian and I are involved in is about, is trying to do that. So the finally getting around to the question that the good folks at the temple had asked Brian and me to deal with, I think my concern about the faith leaders' statement is that it wasn't specific enough. It didn't call out the fossil fuel industry. It didn't directly call on asset managers like BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, which has still trillions of dollars invested in fossil fuels. It didn't call on major banks to change. And the danger of not calling out those specific bad actors is that it implies that all of us in some level are equally responsible. And that's just simply not true. And I don't say that as a way of avoiding personal responsibility for lifestyle change, but I think we have to be real about the fact that, an awful lot of us could change our lifestyles and it still wouldn't matter if the whole energy system is powered by coal and oil and gas. So I think that's to me the biggest challenge to these, important initiatives that have emerged, the faith leader statement and the faith plans. And our good friend Martin Palmer has done a wonderful job with his team on the faith plans. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of them, which is really fantastic. I think what's most important is truly to pay attention to how do we create the level of systemic change, which inevitably means political and financial reform, that's absolutely indispensable. But again, Brian, I really appreciated the way that you sort of grounded this in everyday life and in your context. When I'm not traveling around, I preach at my local church here in Secaucus, New Jersey. And, as a way to try to keep my feet on the ground here, Secaucus is going to be underwater in 75 years at the rate that things are going. And I think that the good news now, in the midst of some really challenging political news, is that more and more people are aware of these kinds of impacts that are starting to face us and are willing to stand up and really demand change from our leaders.
Yeah, just a couple words of response, Fletcher. And that is, in reading this appeal from our leaders, I was very comfortable with the theological concepts they were presenting, et cetera, openness, interdependence, dynamism of love, respect, et cetera, and agreed. And again, it gives me a nomenclature. It gives me the weight of these theological spiritual leaders to then respond to people who are saying things like, well, you're being too alarmist. I understand what you're saying, but you're being an alarmist. Don't keep bringing it up, et cetera. So there's that dynamic going on. But I think what you raised, your critique of the appeal, I think is so on target because, as Bill McKibben said, if you light it with a match, it's got to go. Fossil fuel, et cetera, et cetera. And so where I found myself at this present time is that the urgency just keeps getting ramped up and up and up, because the longer we go without the adequate action by our leaders, the worse it's going to be. So there's a sense of urgency. And my local church here, we have an Earth Honoring Faith committee where we we have solar panels on the church, we get rid of plastic, et cetera, et cetera. We're advocates in our town for declaring a climate emergency, et cetera. So we're doing the practices, we're doing local advocacy, because with the prior administration, nothing was happening on a federal level. So it just put the impetus on working locally, which I think we've done some good things there in terms of the advocate, and we educate. The Faith Science Forum we held. But I think where we're at now is exactly what you pointed out. The criteria for are we make a difference or not is not allowing fossil fuel industries to be subsidized, not to be financed by banks, et cetera, et cetera. And your point that we must now name names and point out directly, not just with theological language, et cetera. We have to point out directly what the problem is. And that's the criteria, is what we're doing. So what it says to me, and this is a big step out, because I think on a lot of people's part, it takes courage to start doing exactly that. I mean, if I get up on Sunday and say, and name fossil fuel and name this, I said something not even directly this past Sunday and about the idea that we can't keep hoping for economic growth that's destroying things. And at the door, the response was, well, it's the economic growth that gets money to poor people, which I definitely, or disadvantaged people, which I definitely disagree with, because we all know that the chasm between rich and poor is wider and wider, and trickle down economics never work. But there's those kind of responses. But what I hear you issuing is a call to name names, point out the problem, point out the players, and to really step up the advocacy. And that's sort of what I will bring back to our Faith Communities Environmental Network. The need now that we have to join the fight with our feet, Rabbi Heschel's, let's start praying with our feet kind of thing. And that's the next frontier, I think, for maybe my local parish, our committee, and our network here on the Cape. So I felt like your critique was really spot on. So I appreciate what you said in terms of its specificity, but I also appreciate the moral vision that the Pope, the Archbishop, the Ecumenical Patriarch gave me too. So it's a lot to think about, but it really helps inspire and direct next steps and actions in the here and now. Because we've been talking about the problems and the science for a long time, but motivating people. And I really think one of the things that came out in reading these documents is the idea that, and they use the word repentance or transformation, change over and over. What we need is a metanoia, a change of consciousness, a change in the way we relate and speak with the world and with all the community of life. And that transformation starts in the individual human soul, but it needs to then get legs and seek action in the world. So, there's a lot there, but I feel like your article and these documents really give us direction and vision and next steps. So,
yeah, I mean, I think, Brian, what I like doing is holding the tension between those religious teachings that you mentioned and these concrete realities. And I think, I think some of this is about leaning into the discomfort. I mean, if we're taking this seriously, we've all got to do that. Nobody, we live in an oil-soaked world. Nobody gets off sort of totally innocent with this stuff. And we need to lean into that. And I also think that, I think this is a case also where it's interesting to think about the religious sociology of many parts of the world, particularly certainly the United States in the last 20 to 30 years, when from our perspective, the culturally ascendant expressions of religion have been substantially conservative evangelical. And their rise has been coupled by a combination of sort of deep religious fervor, plus a particular stance on a select number of social issues. And what we see in the work that we do is that as we work with diverse faith communities and partners, and I see good friends, Brother Kevin Cawley, who's done great work with his group in the Christian Brothers and the Carbon Rangers group that he founded over the years, and Emily Takahashi with the Shambhala Buddhist community and a Green Faith Circle in Boulder. And I know that others on the call have, and the temple has been addressing these issues, the Temple of Understanding, for decades now. I think that where we're at in these moderate to progressive communities of faith is having to make that transition from holding an opinion to taking action. And there's tension anytime any group undertakes that switch, but it is really important. And I think that part of what, gives me hope is that I think that when people do that, it strengthens their faith and it changes the world. And so that to me is a hopeful piece. And I also think that we're at a point in time now where the legitimacy of religion is at stake in certain ways. I mean, we look, whether it's very conservative, white evangelical groups, certain groups in the United States that are very strong supporters of the fossil fuel industry and sort of very strongly opposed to climate action. They're part of this sort of cultural, political, economic nexus that is trying to prevent change from happening. We look in Brazil at the so-called evangelical bench there, which controls the Brazilian parliament and which has been a central part of the Bolsonaro administration's assault on the Amazon and on the rights of Indigenous peoples. I think that part of what we as religious people need to do is be willing to raise these topics publicly in the way that our counterparts have for decades, frankly. And I think that's, part of my understanding is that it's, we're called to do that. And we're being called upon to live out our and publicly embrace our values in a new way. And that may well be uncomfortable. I think it's fantastic for the growth of a religious community. I mean, I think that, anytime people have to really make that decision, that's a good thing for religious communities. And I think that the leadership and the pressure of millennials is absolutely key on this. I mean, I've been doing this work for about 20 years, and Allison and Grove from the Temple of Understanding, and you, Brian, we'll all remember how, really 10, 15 years ago, when you talked about this, you got looked at like you were a little bit weird. That's changed over the last decade, but sort of I'm 58 years old. Sort of my generation of folks in the religious world it's taken a while to wake up to this, and it's so refreshing to and so important to see young people of faith, people of no faith saying, get with the program. This is absolutely unacceptable. It's a form of insanity, what's going on. And I think that that's really important. I, sort of cut my teeth in public activism around the anti-nuclear movement in the 1980s, where our feelings about a nuclear weapon on every corner sort of approach to reality was it was time to say, this is ludicrous. You can't ensure that everybody's safe just by building countless numbers of deadly weapons. And I think we're at that stage now where the rising generations are calling out really deadly blind spots that the rest of us have held and have been able to get away with until now because the natural world won't let us do it anymore. So I think that's another dimension to this that's important.
Yeah. As you were speaking, Fletcher, I was thinking again of Bill McKibben saying, the climate emergency is an opportunity for which the church was born. And it is our opportunity, as mainline institutional religions get more and more sidelines, this is our opportunity to join with young people. Because in my experience, young people get it. It's people my age and above, which there's a lot of on the Cape because it's a retirement community. Those are the people that need to get on board more. And they always say, oh, well, young people, let's get them involved. They're already there. We need to catch up with them, kind of thing. And I also believe that the church has to reestablish, and this is another opportunity, our connections with science. And that's what we try to do here on the Cape with Woods Hole and Woodwell Research, et cetera, et cetera. Go jointly, different ways of experiencing and knowing reality, but both complementary. And as an example, a few years ago, Vineyard Wind was going through all the permitting processes. It was during President Trump's administration, and there was a lot of pushback against it, trying to kill it. So they organized a press conference here on the Cape, and they had 7 or 9, I can't remember, spokespersons to speak at this press conference. And they came from science, they came from business communities, all who were in favor of Vineyard Wind. And I represented our faith communities environmental network, and we each had about 90 seconds. And I don't even remember what I said, but I started by saying the climate emergency is a moral imperative. Later, when NPR and some of the, not NPR, but the local NPR affiliate in Boston picked up the conference, they played the statement of the faith communities. That was the only one they played in the description of what it was. So my point in all that is this, that society at large is looking for the kind of moral vision, the moral direction that the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, you, the church, and others are offering. Again, it's our opportunity to step up and step out, and with some courage, with some conviction, but with a vision, and we have the infrastructure to do it, the communication, the network, etc. So I'm just hoping that we live up to that goal, and that's what we're struggling to do here on Cape Cod.
And I think the other piece of the picture that is really important is for religious communities to get specific, both about the bad stuff that needs to stop and also the climate solutions that need to happen. We're doing an increasing amount of work in the US in a couple of locations with Latinx and African American religious leaders, talking about the opportunity for them really to help support some important benefits for their communities by being at the table firmly around green job development, green job training and placement opportunities, which will not happen automatically in a racially and economically just way. And so I think that that's the other piece that's really key at this moment, is to be clear, we need the government to stop permitting these new destructive projects. We need banks and asset managers to cut out financing them. And we also need governments and businesses to be investing in racially and economically just ways in climate solutions. And I mean, we have seen that, making sure that that happens right is going to take work. I mean, I could share stories about different green industries that don't, in many cases, really, from our perspective, understand yet what it means to really work to dismantle the legacy of racism that's left so many people with far fewer resources and far less well-being than they ought to have. So I think that's the other piece, is to pay attention to the solutions and make sure we get those right, not only from a climate perspective, but from the perspective of the well-being of workers and communities.
Yeah. We recently hosted a Zoom webinar with Richard Rothstein. He's the author of a book called The Color of Law, a lawyer. The book was longlisted for the National Book Award, I think in 2016 or 17. And he joined us, and as some of you may know, his work revolves around the idea that racism has been written into local, state, and national law in the area, in many areas, but especially in the areas of housing. And I listened to him lay that out, and I read the book, and it's fascinating, and it's just so unequivocal, the conclusions he reaches. But around the same time, there was an article in the New York Times, and it had an overlay that showed every neighborhood in New York City and in Boston and certain cities. And the overlay was the amount of green space, and it compared to the level of income. And you could see exactly by race and by income, no trees. I mean, the canopy, et cetera. So my point is, it's all connected. This climate crisis touches everything, all the ills, the social ills that ail us at this point. But I recently reread Martin Luther King's sermon, where he brings up the term maladjusted, a sort of term from psychology. And he basically says, unless we get maladjusted to racism, and I want to be maladjusted to racism and all the social ills. And it really applies to the environment. Until we get maladjusted to all the is fueling this crisis and the destruction and degradation of people and places, until we get that level of maladjustment, people don't act. That's part of the tension building. And what I hear you saying, Fletcher, when translating some of what you're talking about to my own context, part of what I need to do here is turn up the heat on the groups I work with, but just not blow the roof off the place. But you're walking that subtle line in a local community like a church, where you really have to challenge, you have to name names, you have to upset people. It's not about my comfort. It's, as you said, it's really understanding that we're trying to prevent misery and suffering of a lot of people. And that gives me a lot more courage to do that. But it's all that challenging and turning that heat up, but yet trying to keep the roof on the place and trying to stay employed.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure to hear your diverse, but totally sympathetic discussion of this. And I'm Grove Harris with the Temple of Understanding. And yes, I've been working in this area for a long time, and I've had the pleasure of working with both of you. Fletcher, I'll never forget seeing you in front of a line of Muslim women that you were encouraging to be the very front of an interfaith section of a climate march in Washington, DC. So I have photos of you in action in that regard. And Brian, I have seen you and Susan use both of your skills so sympathetically with each other to really foster this FCEN on the Cape and bring us to this place of calling for eco-justice and the whole myriad of ways that people there are doing work in the local county government sessions, and the tension there of having to get some recalcitrant members to really change their votes and get their act together to understand that as parents, they are on the hook to provide a livable environment for their young ones. So both of you are terrific to work with. And I think that you've said that intersectionality, as it's called, everything matters. Racism matters. Economics matters. Where the trees are matter. That women are in leadership matters. That men are in leadership in ways that are gentle and inclusive, and both gentle and fierce, but in a non-toxic power over kind of way. So I know that, Fletcher, I've been on the calls that your movement building organization is working with, and they're all led by diverse people, young people. It's clearly inclusive. And I know that at the UN, what they say is we need political will, that these governments are not going to do it. They, like all of us, are in a way cowed by these fossil fuel companies and the power of these extractive industries. And it's also clear, I think, Fletcher, you were talking about this, that we have to be smart. These extractive processes exist in so many layers of our political world, and in the ways that money is given to third world countries, which in fact extracts more from them and is not an act of generosity. That these kinds of extractions are, we have to see them at all their levels. And we have to not be so silly as to think that ending fossil fuel subsidies will be easy, but it needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to take care of the needs of people. So for example, if those subsidies end and fuel prices go way up, we need to subsidize the delivery of food on the Cape, because I have found that the only way for me to work internationally with integrity is to also work locally. Mm-hmm. And so I noticed that at the supermarkets on the Cape, chicken is sold unbelievably cheaply. And many of my neighbors require that in order to sustain their economic status because they're in a very difficult economy and they're not able to earn year-round incomes in our retirement and in our resort economy. And the milk that is sold in the gas stations is also subsidized. So we have to sign on both to call out those names and to call out those industries and to call out the governments and to call out our tax, the way our taxes are organized, and then to stay present to how are we going to make sure that that social justice trickles down, which it won't, but from the grassroots up is informed about where it needs to be. And you've both agreed totally that the younger generation and Greta Thunberg with her blah, 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 she doesn't want to hear it anymore. And I feel kind of the same way. And I'm sure, Susie, we can send out some of the links to what's been mentioned here in the aftermath of this call. There's a great new video about actually a dinosaur entering into the UN hall and taking the podium and chastising all of the political figures there to say, why are you financing your own extinction? So we do need creativity and all different ways of addressing our local personal actions and calling out on all the institutions, including the churches. One of the ideas that I got from Paul Hawken in his book Regeneration is, what if we really, really decided we only have 10 years and every philanthropic institution and every person who expects to leave something to their children and grandchildren thinks about investing that money as a moral call in the next 10 years. So just as you said, Brian, some ways to ramp up the pressure. But I'm going to be quiet now because we'd love to have some questions from people who've been on this call, and also Brian and Fletcher from, yourself to each other if there's something burning. But the idea is to have some spaciousness here, to let Zoom be a way that we speak with each other, not simply at each other.
One brief thought while we're waiting for a question is, and Grove, you've been doing good work at the UN. From our perspective, one of the things that religious groups need to do is to push for actions immediately. I think that one of the dangers of a lot of the political and economic discourse about this is everybody's talking about net zero by 2050 or such and such by 2035 or whatever. And when religious groups talk about compassion, we don't say, well, we'll aim for compassion by 2040. Or when we talk about love or justice, we don't say we're going to start doing justice in 2050. And I just think that there's, in terms of how people change and how cultures change, immediacy matters. Look at the remarkable change over the past year and a half around COVID, with a situation that was managed in admittedly a highly imperfect and in many ways tragically unjust kind of way. And look at how much change has been possible. Mm-hmm. So I think that, this idea about 2050 and 2030 needs to, I think we really need to push back on that as an acceptable sort of way of framing things, because all it does, I'm a professional in this, all it does for me is kick the can down the road. Yeah. So for the average person who doesn't want to spend all their waking hours thinking about this, how can we blame anybody? And I also don't think it's cynical to suggest that there is intentionality behind that. Let's just be real about what's happening here.
Yeah. I keep thinking the word that keeps flashing in it to me at this stage of the climate emergency is urgency. Mm-hmm. And, I think of Howard Thurman's, work vis-a-vis Christianity. What does Christianity say when your back's to the wall? Well, our back is to the wall. So the rhetoric, the actions do need to be accelerated and intensified and made clearer and more specific, as you mentioned, Fletcher.
And I think there's a role particularly for pastors to help us now in such divisive times where we can't really trust the ability of the public to be informed and to have civil discussion about what's happening. So I agree totally that this net zero is not the same thing as zero. And we need to move with much more speed, particularly given all of the science that's coming out now. And also that there's something amazing about stepping into solutions and doing it together. And it's scary because the wind farms right off the Cape, they're building on my beach. I've already gotten like, I can't go to my beach anymore. And it's not going to be perfect. We've understood now that the crabs are going to be impacted in ways nobody's taken into account. So it's really going to be a mess, but we have to move.
Fletcher, what is your recommendations, given the urgency, given the speed at which we need to act? What are your recommendations for faith communities and individuals on how to move forward? You did obviously name in the article, we have to be specific, naming names and naming the problem, tracing it to fossil fuel, et cetera, et cetera. But is it more demonstrations, more petitions, more getting involved with your local select boards or town governments?
I think your metaphor of turning the heat up is the right one, Brian, in terms of, and there are a lot of different ways to do that. I don't think that there is only one tactic that is effective in terms of doing that. But I think that, and it has to happen in a lot of different formats. I am a person who believes that peacefully disruptive public action is really, if you look at human history, that is how an awful lot of moral social change happens. I think back to the, again, the 80s and the AIDS crisis and the importance of the group ACT UP. I think which was disruptive in ways that were upsetting to many and which were challenging for many, but frankly, which were a matter of life and death for so many people. So I think that I do think that I think, whether you use the turning up the temperature metaphor or the peaceful but intentional disruption metaphor, I think they're all really, I think that approach matters. I think it's important to bring it up more in conversation. I think for religious communities, I think to identify how you can join together with some of the most visionary and ambitious coalitions that are doing this work, because as a religious sector on our own, we're not going to be able to change things at a level that's needed. And that's implicit, Brian. I mean, you when you introduced yourself, you shared all the different coalitions and, multi-sector groups that you're working. That's how change happens. And I think that for religious groups, aiming high, not being afraid to call for change that may seem really unrealistic, but I mean, 10 years ago, we were early involved in the fossil fuel divestment movement. And, back then when you started, people thought, oh, this is just ridiculous. You can't invest in the stock market without having oil and gas companies in your portfolio. And now here we are a decade on, almost $40 trillion have been committed to some form of fossil fuel divestment. The industry is now really quite changed in terms of how it's viewed within the financial sector. It's no longer blue chip. It's much more speculative. It's much more risky, and that's appropriate. And that movement played a big role in that. So I think being, I would not look towards religious groups embracing sort of an incrementalist approach. I think it's a time to be visionary and bold and really to go for it. The added benefit of that is, frankly, it excites people a lot more. So, and I think to sort of have faith that there are a lot of people out there who are waiting to see this kind of leadership and who are waiting to be challenged and inspired, and who are grateful when that happens. I think, I always have to remind myself when I'm going into sort of, preach in places where I don't know, but I can tell from the body language that people are, a little anxious. You got to remind yourself there are people who want us to bring it and who want to believe. And that's, Brian, I think you and I know that's part of our job as religious leaders, is to help make that possible for folks.
Yeah. And I think that's a great answer. And I always, and I don't have the answer, but the question I always ask myself is, what is the unique contribution of faith communities, of institutional religion, of spirituality? What is our unique contribution to this movement? And I think of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and beyond, and really it was about a transformation of soul and a transformation of society, and you need both. You need to transform the body, you need the transformation of soul. So we have tools. What are they uniquely, and what is our contribution as faith communities?
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Alison, I think that's your cue to come in, because we've run out of time.
I think so too. I think this has been a fabulous talk. And I just want to remind everybody that this has been recorded. It will be available on the templeofunderstanding.org website under the topic of eco-justice for all. So please, I know, because we've had all these problems on the Cape and the islands with the latest storm, that a lot of people that wanted to be here haven't been able to be here. So please let everyone know that they can tune in to this incredible discussion anytime they want. So I want to also just let all of you know that the Temple of Understanding's next Eco-Justice for All series program will be on November 18th. That's a Thursday from 1 to 2 Eastern Standard Time. It's Zoom. The topic is Eco-Theologians on the Urgency of the Climate Crisis, a post-COP26 commentary. And our invited guest speakers, Imam Safet Kadovich, who has recently been appointed as head of the Islamic Society of North American Washington, D.C. office, Dr. Aaron Lothes, who is a theologian at St. Elizabeth University, Morristown, New Jersey, and Reverend Henrik Grape, senior advocate on creation care for the World Council of Churches. So I hope you'll all join us on November 28th. And I just want to thank our speakers so much for a very lively and thoughtful discussion. They've given us so much to think about, and so many wonderful ideas that we can move forward on.